What would you do if you were just minding your own business, living your life, and suddenly, your entire world was turned upside down by someone who was supposed to protect you? What if that person was a police officer, and they decided to destroy your life simply because of the color of your skin? Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, for one man, this nightmare became a terrifying reality. Before we dive into this shocking story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you won't believe how this unfolds. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the small town of Cedarville. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the streets as people headed home after a long day. Jamal Carter, a 28-year-old black man, was walking home from his job at the local grocery store. Jamal was known in the community as a hard-working, kind-hearted guy who always had a smile on his face. He had dreams of opening his own business one day, a small cafe where people could gather, share stories, and enjoy good food. But for now, he was focused on saving every penny he could. Jamal lived with his younger sister, Tasha, who was in her final year of high school. Their parents had passed away in a car accident 5 years ago, and Jamal had taken on the role of provider and protector for his sister. He worked long hours, but he never complained. Tasha was his motivation, and he was determined to give her a better life. As Jamal turned the corner onto his street, he noticed a police cruiser slowly driving behind him. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the officer was just patrolling the neighborhood. But something felt off. The cruiser followed him for 2 blocks, the engine purring softly as it kept pace with his every step. Jamal's heart began to race. He told himself to stay calm, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Suddenly, the cruiser's lights flashed on, and the siren blared, piercing the quiet evening. Jamal froze. The car screeched to a halt beside him, and Officer Brett Holloway stepped out. Holloway was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression that rarely softened. He had a reputation in Cedarville, but not a good one. Many in the black community had stories about him, stories of harassment, intimidation, and blatant racism. Jamal had heard those stories, but he never thought he'd be the one living one. Holloway had grown up in Cedarville, the son of a retired police officer. He had always been told that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who followed the rules and those who didn't. In his mind, he was the enforcer of those rules, the one who kept the town safe. But over the years, his sense of duty had warped into something darker. He saw himself as above the law, a judge and jury in his own right, and he had a particular disdain for the black community, believing they were the root of most of the town's problems. It was a mindset that had cost him friendships, relationships, and any sense of empathy he might have once had. "Hands where I can see them," Holloway barked, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Jamal complied immediately, raising his hands in the air. His mind raced. What was happening? Why was he being stopped? He hadn't done anything wrong. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jamal asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Shut your mouth and don't move," Holloway snapped. He walked over to Jamal, his boots crunching on the gravel. Without warning, he grabbed Jamal by the arm and shoved him against the cruiser. Jamal's face pressed against the cold metal as Holloway began patting him down. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "I was just walking home." "I said shut your mouth," Holloway growled. He finished the pat-down and stepped back, a smug look on his face. Well, what do we have here?" he said, holding up a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Jamal's eyes widened in horror. "That's not mine," he exclaimed. "I've never seen that before in my life." "Sure it's not," Holloway said with a sneer. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal drugs." Jamal's heart sank. He knew what was happening. Holloway had planted the drugs on him. This wasn't about justice or keeping the community safe. This was about power, control, and racism. Jamal felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over him as Holloway slapped handcuffs on his wrists and shoved him into the back of the cruiser. As the car pulled away, Jamal stared out the window, his mind racing. How could this be happening? What was going to happen to him now? He thought about Tasha, who was waiting for him at home. She had a big math test tomorrow, and he had promised to help her study. He thought about the cafe he dreamed of opening, the life he was trying to build. All of it was slipping away because of one man's hatred. But little did Jamal know, this was just the beginning. What happened next would shock everyone in Cedarville, and maybe even the world. The cruiser sped through the streets, the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the houses they passed. Jamal sat in silence, his hands cuffed behind his back, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He kept replaying the moment Holloway pulled out the bag of drugs. How had it gotten there? He hadn't felt the officer slip it into his pocket. It had all happened so fast. When they arrived at the police station, Holloway dragged Jamal out of the car and into the building. The other officers barely glanced up as they passed. It was as if this was just another day. Another black man being brought in for no reason. Jamal's stomach churned. He felt like he was in a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. Holloway led him to a small interrogation room and pushed him into a chair. "Sit tight," he said with a smirk before slamming the door shut. Jamal was alone, the fluorescent light above him buzzing softly. He tried to steady his breathing, to think clearly. He needed a plan. He needed to prove his innocence. But how? Minutes felt like hours as Jamal sat there, his mind racing. Finally, the door opened, and Holloway walked back in, followed by another officer. This one was younger, with a nervous energy about him. His name was Officer Ryan Patel, a rookie who had joined the force 6 months ago. Ryan had grown up in Cedarville too, but his experience was vastly different from Holloway's. His parents were immigrants from India, and he had faced his share of discrimination growing up. He had joined the police force to make a difference, to be the kind of officer who actually helped people. But the reality of the job was starting to weigh on him. He had seen things that made him question whether he was on the right side of the law. "So, Jamal," Holloway said, leaning against the table, "you ready to confess?" "I didn't do anything," Jamal said firmly. "Those drugs aren't mine. You planted them on me." Holloway chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "That's a serious accusation, Jamal. You sure you want to stick with that story?" "It's the truth," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Holloway's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. He leaned in close, his face just inches from Jamal's. "Listen here, boy," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing. And by the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you had just confessed." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to fight back, to scream, to do something, but he was powerless. He was at the mercy of a man who had no mercy to give. Just then, the door burst open, and a woman stormed in. She was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. Her name was Detective Elena Morales, and she was known for being one of the few officers in Cedarville who actually cared about justice. Elena had grown up in a rough neighborhood, and had seen firsthand how the system failed people. She had worked her way up the ranks, determined to be a voice for the voiceless. But even she had her limits, and she was starting to wonder how much longer she could keep fighting a system that seemed rigged against her. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her eyes darting between Jamal and Holloway. Holloway straightened up, his smirk returning. "Just doing my job, Morales. Caught this one with drugs. He's refusing to cooperate." Morales narrowed her eyes. "Is that so?" She turned to Jamal. "Is that true?" "No," Jamal said quickly. "He planted the drugs on me. I didn't do anything wrong." Morales studied him for a moment, then turned back to Holloway. "We'll see about that," she said. "But until we get this sorted out, you're done here, Holloway. I'll take it from here." Holloway's smirk faltered, but he didn't argue. He shot Jamal one last glare before storming out of the room. Morales sighed and sat down across from Jamal. "All right," she said. "Let's start from the beginning." As Jamal began to tell his story, he couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was about to happen. Little did he know, his arrest was just the first domino to fall in a chain of events that would expose the dark underbelly of Cedarville's police department. And when the truth finally came out, it would shock everyone to their core. Detective Elena Morales leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying Jamal Carter as he recounted the events of the evening. She had seen this kind of thing before. Good people caught in bad situations, often because of the actions of a few corrupt officers. But something about Jamal's story struck her differently. There was a sincerity in his voice, a desperation that felt real. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, they were telling her that Jamal was telling the truth. "All right, Jamal," she said, her tone softer now. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Jamal took a deep breath and began. He told her about his job at the grocery store, his dreams of opening a cafe, and his younger sister, Tasha, who depended on him. He explained how he was just walking home when Officer Holloway stopped him, planted the drugs, and arrested him. As he spoke, Morales took notes, her mind racing. If what Jamal was saying was true, this wasn't just a case of misconduct. It was a blatant abuse of power. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Officer Brett Holloway was fuming. He had been ordered to stand down, and the thought of Detective Morales meddling in his case made his blood boil. He stormed into the break room, where Officer Ryan Patel was sitting, sipping a cup of coffee. Patel looked up, startled by Holloway's sudden entrance. "What's going on, Brett?" Patel asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Morales is sticking her nose where it doesn't belong," Holloway snapped. "She's in there with that Carter kid, acting like she's some kind of hero." Patel hesitated. He had been wrestling with his own doubts about Holloway for weeks now. The older officer's methods were aggressive, often crossing the line into outright cruelty. Patel had joined the force to make a difference, but lately, he felt like he was just enabling the very system he had wanted to change. "Maybe she's just doing her job," Patel said carefully. "If the kid's innocent—" "Innocent?" Holloway interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're buying that? He's just another thug, Ryan. They're all the same." Patel frowned but didn't respond. He knew arguing with Holloway was pointless. The man was set in his ways, blind to his own biases. But Patel couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation, even if it meant going against Holloway. Back in the interrogation room, Morales finished her conversation with Jamal and stood up. "I'm going to look into this," she said. "But for now, you're going to have to stay here. I'll do what I can to make sure you're treated fairly." Jamal nodded, though his heart sank. He had hoped Morales would let him go, but he understood that the system didn't work that way. Still, he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time since his arrest, someone was actually listening to him. As Morales left the room, she ran into Patel in the hallway. The young officer looked nervous, but there was a determination in his eyes that caught her attention. "Detective Morales," he said, lowering his voice. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Morales raised an eyebrow, but nodded. They stepped into an empty office, and Patel closed the door behind them. "What's on your mind, Patel?" Morales asked. "It's about Holloway," Patel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think he's been crossing the line. Not just tonight, but for a while now. I've seen things that don't sit right with me." Morales studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I've had my suspicions too, but if we're going to do something about it, we're going to need evidence. Hard evidence." Patel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I've been recording some of our interactions," he admitted. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe it would protect me if things went south." Morales' eyes widened. "That's a risky move, Patel. If Holloway finds out—" "I know," Patel interrupted. "But I can't just stand by and do nothing. Not anymore." Morales nodded slowly, a plan forming in her mind. "All right, let's see what you've got." Meanwhile, Jamal sat alone in the interrogation room, his mind racing. He thought about Tasha, who was probably worried sick by now. He thought about his job, his dreams, his future, all of it hanging in the balance. He clenched his fists, frustration and fear bubbling up inside him. He couldn't just sit here and do nothing. He had to fight back. But how? Just then, the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence. His name was Marcus Reed, a defense attorney who had made a name for himself in Cedarville by taking on cases that others wouldn't touch. He had been called in by Detective Morales, who knew that Jamal would need all the help he could get. "Jamal Carter?" Reed asked, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus Reed. I'm here to help you." Jamal shook his hand, relief flooding through him. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do anything wrong. They planted drugs on me." Reed nodded, his expression serious. "I believe you, but we're going to need to prove it. Tell me everything." As Jamal began to recount his story again, Reed listened intently, his mind already working on a strategy. He had dealt with cases like this before, and he knew how hard it would be to fight against a system that was stacked against them. But he also knew that sometimes the truth had a way of coming out, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. Outside the police station, the night was quiet, but tensions were rising. Detective Morales and Officer Patel were poring over the recordings Patel had made, their determination growing with each passing minute. Holloway, unaware of the storm brewing around him, was in his office, confident that he had everything under control. But he was wrong. Very wrong. The recordings on Officer Ryan Patel's phone were damning. Detective Elena Morales listened intently, her jaw tightening as she heard Brett Holloway's voice, laced with arrogance and venom, making racist remarks and openly discussing how he planned to teach Jamal Carter a lesson. Patel sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly together, his face pale but resolute. "This is enough to open an internal investigation," Morales said finally, setting the phone down on the table. "But it's not enough to guarantee Jamal's freedom. We need more. We need witnesses, evidence, something that ties Holloway directly to planting those drugs." Patel nodded, though he looked uneasy. "What if Holloway finds out we're onto him? He's not going to go down without a fight." "He won't," Morales agreed, "which is why we need to be careful. For now, keep this between us. Don't let Holloway suspect anything. I'll reach out to Marcus Reed, Jamal's attorney. He'll know how to use this." As Morales and Patel strategized, Jamal sat in a holding cell, his mind racing. Marcus Reed had left an hour ago, promising to return first thing in the morning with a plan. But the night stretched on, and Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. He thought about Tasha, who was probably pacing their small apartment, wondering where he was. He thought about his job at the grocery store. What would happen if he didn't show up tomorrow? Would they fire him? And what about his dreams of opening a cafe? Would this arrest haunt him forever? The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Officer Holloway standing outside his cell, a smug grin on his face. "Comfortable, Carter?" Holloway asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jamal didn't respond. He knew better than to engage. Holloway was looking for a reaction, and Jamal wasn't going to give him one. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Holloway continued, leaning against the bars. "Calling in a lawyer, acting like you're innocent. But let me tell you something. No one's going to believe you. You're just another thug, and thugs like you belong behind bars." Jamal clenched his fists but stayed silent. Holloway's words stung, but he refused to let the officer see how much they affected him. Holloway chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "You're not going to win this, Carter. You might as well give up now." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jamal alone with his thoughts. But as much as Holloway's words hurt, they also fueled something inside Jamal, a determination to fight back, to prove his innocence, no matter what it took. The next morning, Marcus Reed returned to the police station, a folder full of documents tucked under his arm. He met with Detective Morales and Officer Patel in a small conference room, where they filled him in on the recordings and their plan to build a case against Holloway. "This is good," Reed said after listening to the recordings. "But we need more. We need to find out if Holloway has done this before. If there's a pattern, we can use it to show that this wasn't an isolated incident." Morales nodded. "I've already started looking into his past cases. There are a few that raise red flags, but we'll need to dig deeper." "What about Jamal's arrest?" Patel asked. "Can we get him out of here?" "Not yet," Reed said, "but we can file a motion to have the charges dismissed based on the evidence we have so far. It's a long shot, but it's worth a try." As they continued to strategize, Tasha Carter was making her own moves. She had spent the night frantically calling everyone she could think of, friends, family, even Jamal's co-workers, trying to figure out what had happened to her brother. When she finally learned that he had been arrested, she was devastated. But Tasha wasn't the type to sit back and do nothing. She was determined to help her brother, no matter what it took. She showed up at the police station that morning, her eyes red from crying but her resolve unwavering. She demanded to see Jamal, but the officers at the front desk brushed her off, telling her to come back later. Frustrated but undeterred, Tasha decided to take matters into her own hands. She pulled out her phone and started recording a video. "My name is Tasha Carter," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "My brother, Jamal Carter, was arrested last night for a crime he didn't commit. The police planted drugs on him, and now they're trying to ruin his life. I'm not going to let them get away with this. If you're watching this, please share it. We need all the help we can get." She posted the video on social media, tagging local news outlets and civil rights organizations. Within minutes, the video started gaining traction. People were outraged, and the hashtag Justice for Jamal began trending. Back at the station, Morales, Reed, and Patel were unaware of Tasha's video, but they were about to get a wake-up call. The station's phone lines started ringing off the hook, and reporters began showing up, demanding answers. Holloway, who had been lounging in his office, was summoned by the chief of police. "What the hell is going on, Holloway?" the chief demanded. "There's a mob outside, and the media is all over this Jamal Carter case. Did you plant drugs on him?" Holloway's face turned red. "Of course not, Chief. The kid's lying. He's just trying to save his own skin." The chief didn't look convinced. "I don't care what he's saying. This is a PR nightmare. You need to fix it, and you need to fix it now." As Holloway left the chief's office, he ran into Patel in the hallway. The younger officer avoided eye contact, but Holloway could tell something was off. "What's going on, Patel?" Holloway asked, his tone suspicious. "Nothing," Patel said quickly. "Just trying to stay out of the way." Holloway narrowed his eyes, but didn't press further. He had bigger problems to deal with. Meanwhile, Jamal was finally allowed to make a phone call. He dialed Tasha's number, his heart pounding as he waited for her to pick up. "Jamal." Tasha's voice was filled with relief. "Are you okay?" "What's happening?" "I'm okay," Jamal said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "They're saying I had drugs on me, but I didn't, Tasha. I swear." "I know you didn't," Tasha said firmly. "I posted a video online, and people are starting to notice. We're going to get you out of there, Jamal. I promise." Jamal felt a surge of gratitude. His little sister, who he had always protected, was now fighting for him. It gave him the strength to keep going. As the day wore on, the pressure continued to mount. The media frenzy outside the station grew louder, and the chief of police was forced to hold a press conference. He tried to downplay the situation, but the reporters weren't buying it. Questions about Holloway's conduct and the allegations of planted evidence dominated the discussion. Inside the station, Morales, Reed, and Patel were working tirelessly to build their case. They knew they were running out of time. If they didn't act soon, Holloway might find a way to cover his tracks. But just as they were about to make their move, something unexpected happened. A woman walked into the station, her face pale and her hands trembling. She asked to speak to Detective Morales, and when she was brought into the conference room, she dropped a bombshell. "My name is Linda Harper," she said. "I'm a nurse at Cedarville General. A few months ago, I was pulled over by Officer Holloway. He planted drugs in my car and threatened to arrest me unless I did what he said." The room fell silent as Linda Harper's words sank in. This was the break they had been waiting for. Linda Harper's revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Detective Elena Morales, Marcus Reed, and Officer Ryan Patel exchanged glances, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about a pattern of abuse, a systemic issue that went far beyond one arrest. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Morales asked, her voice calm but urgent. Linda nodded, her hand still trembling as she recounted the incident. "I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital when Holloway pulled me over. He said I was speeding, but I wasn't. He made me get out of the car, and then he found a bag of drugs in my glove compartment. I swear they weren't mine. I've never even touched drugs in my life." "What happened next?" Reed asked, leaning forward. He threatened to arrest me, Linda said, her voice breaking. But then he said he'd let me go if I did what he wanted. She paused, tears welling up in her eyes. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. So I agreed. I thought if I just went along with it, it would be over. But it wasn't. He's been blackmailing me ever since. Morales's jaw tightened. Do you have any proof of this? Texts, emails, anything? Linda nodded and pulled out her phone. I've saved everything. Texts, voicemails, even a recording of one of our conversations. I knew I'd need it someday. Reed took the phone and began scrolling through the evidence. His expression grew darker with each message he read. This is it, he said finally. This is what we need to take Holloway down. Meanwhile, Officer Brett Holloway was growing increasingly uneasy. The media frenzy outside the station was bad enough, but now he could feel the walls closing in. He had always been careful to cover his tracks, but Linda Harper's sudden appearance had thrown a wrench in his plans. He needed to act fast. He cornered Patel in the break room, his eyes blazing with anger. What's going on, Patel? He demanded. Why is Morales all over this Carter case? And who the hell is that woman who just walked in? Patel hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he had to be careful. If Holloway suspected anything, it could blow the entire investigation. I don't know, he said finally. Morales is just doing her job, I guess. And the woman? I think she's here to file a complaint or something. Holloway narrowed his eyes. A complaint? About what? Patel shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. I didn't ask. It's none of my business. Holloway studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but if you hear anything, you let me know. Got it. Got it, Patel said, though his stomach churned with guilt. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Back in the conference room, Morales, Reed, and Patel were finalizing their plan. They had enough evidence to bring Holloway in for questioning, but they needed to move carefully. If they tipped him off too soon, he might try to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. We'll need to bring in the chief, Morales said. He's not going to like it, but we don't have a choice. Reed nodded. Agreed. But we need to make sure he doesn't warn Holloway. If Holloway gets wind of this, he'll disappear before we can stop him. Patel cleared his throat. What about Jamal? We can't leave him in there any longer. He's innocent. We'll get him out, Reed said firmly. But first, we need to make sure Holloway can't hurt anyone else. As they prepared to confront the chief, Tasha Carter's video continued to gain traction online. The hashtag Justice for Jamal was trending nationwide, and people were demanding answers. Protesters had gathered outside the police station, their voices loud and unwavering. The pressure was mounting, and the chief of police knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. When Morales, Reed, and Patel walked into his office, he was already on edge. What's this about? He asked, his tone clipped. We have evidence that Officer Holloway has been planting evidence and blackmailing citizens, Morales said, getting straight to the point. We need to bring him in for questioning. The chief's face turned red. You have any idea what you're saying? Holloway's one of our best officers. If this gets out, it's already out, Reed interrupted. The media's all over it, and the public is demanding answers. If you don't act now, this department is going to be in even bigger trouble. The chief hesitated, then sighed. All right, bring him in. But if this blows up in our faces, it's on you. Holloway was in his office when Morales and Patel came to get him. He looked up, his expression wary. What's this about? We need to ask you a few questions, Morales said, her tone neutral. Come with us. Holloway's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to cause a scene in front of his colleagues. He followed them to the interrogation room, his mind racing. He had always been one step ahead, but now he could feel the ground crumbling beneath him. As they entered the room, Reed was waiting, the folder of evidence spread out on the table. Holloway's eyes flicked to the documents, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. What's this? He asked, though he already knew the answer. This, Reed said, his voice cold, is the end of the road for you, Holloway. Outside the station, the crowd was growing louder. Tasha stood at the front, her voice hoarse from shouting, but her spirit unbroken. She didn't know what was happening inside, but she could feel that something was about to change. And she was right. Inside the interrogation room, Holloway's facade was crumbling. The evidence was overwhelming, and he knew he was cornered. But he wasn't going down without a fight. "You think you've won?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think this changes anything? The system's rigged, and you know it. People like me always come out on top." Morales leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Not this time, Holloway. Not this time." The tension in the room was palpable, but outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the crowd. Change was coming, and no one could stop it. The interrogation room was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Brett Holloway sat across from Detective Elena Morales and Marcus Reed, his face a mask of defiance. But beneath the surface, his confidence was cracking. The evidence laid out on the table was undeniable. Texts, recordings, witness statements, all pointing to his corruption. "You've got nothing," Holloway said finally, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "This is all circumstantial. You can't prove anything." Reed leaned forward, his expression steely. "We have more than enough to charge you, Holloway. Planting evidence, blackmail, abuse of power. This isn't just a slap on the wrist. You're looking at years in prison." Holloway's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew Reed was right, but admitting it would mean the end of everything he had built. His career, his reputation, his freedom, all of it was slipping through his fingers. Morales crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "It's over, Holloway. The only question is how much worse you want to make it for yourself. If you cooperate, maybe we can cut you a deal. But if you keep playing games, you're going down hard." Holloway's eyes flicked between Morales and Reed, his mind racing. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now he was backed into a corner, and he didn't like it. "I want a lawyer," he said finally, his voice low. Reed nodded. "That's your right. But think carefully about what you do next, Holloway. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone you've hurt. People like Jamal Carter and Linda Harper. They deserve justice." Holloway didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands clenched into fists, as Morales and Reed left the room. Outside the interrogation room, Morales let out a long breath. "That went about as well as expected," she said, running a hand through her hair. Reed nodded. "He's not going to make this easy, but we've got him. It's only a matter of time." As they walked down the hallway, they were met by Officer Ryan Patel, who looked anxious but determined. "What's the plan now?" he asked. "We need to make sure Jamal gets released," Morales said. "With the evidence we have, there's no way the charges will stick. Reed's going to file a motion to dismiss." Patel nodded, though his expression was troubled. "What about Holloway? He's not going to just sit back and let this happen. He's dangerous." "We know," Reed said, "but we've got the upper hand now. He's not going to be able to weasel his way out of this." Meanwhile, Jamal was still in his cell, his mind racing. He had heard the commotion outside, the protesters, the media, but he had no idea what was happening. All he knew was that he was innocent, and he was determined to prove it. When the door to his cell finally opened, he looked up to see Marcus Reed standing there, a small smile on his face. "You're free to go," Reed said. "The charges have been dropped." Jamal's heart leapt. "What? How?" "We've got evidence that Holloway planted the drugs," Reed explained. "It's over, Jamal. You're going home." Jamal couldn't believe it. He stood up, his legs shaky, and followed Reed out of the cell. As they walked through the station, he saw Morales and Patel waiting for him. Morales gave him a nod, her expression one of quiet satisfaction, while Patel looked relieved. "Thank you," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." "Just keep fighting," Morales said. "This isn't over yet." Outside the station, the crowd erupted into cheers as Jamal walked out, his head held high. Tasha was the first to reach him, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. "I knew you'd get out," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it." Jamal hugged her back, his own eyes filling with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you." he said. "You're amazing, Tasha." As the siblings embraced, the crowd continued to cheer, their voices a powerful reminder of the strength of community. But amidst the celebration, there was still a sense of unease. Holloway might have been caught, but the system that allowed him to thrive was still intact. Back at the station, Morales, Reed, and Patel were already planning their next move. They knew that taking down Holloway was just the first step. There were others like him, others who abused their power and got away with it, and they were determined to bring them to justice. "We need to keep the pressure on," Morales said. "This case has brought a lot of attention to the department. We can't let it fade away." Reed nodded. "Agreed. We'll need to work with the community, build trust, and make sure this never happens again." Patel hesitated, then spoke up. "I want to help. I know I'm just a rookie, but I want to be part of the change." Morales gave him a small smile. "You already are, Patel. You did the right thing, even when it was hard. That's what being a good cop is all about." As the sun set over Cedarville, the town felt different. There was a sense of hope, of possibility, but there was also a recognition of the work that still needed to be done. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were on the right path. Jamal and Tasha walked home together, their steps lighter than they had been in days. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they had each other, and a community that was ready to stand with them. And as for Holloway, he sat alone in his cell, his future uncertain. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and for the first time in his life, he was facing the consequences of his actions. But this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the next chapter was about to begin. The days following Jamal's release were a whirlwind of emotions. While he was relieved to be free, the weight of what had happened still hung over him. The arrest, the humiliation, the fear. It wasn't something he could just shake off. But he wasn't alone. Tasha was by his side, and the community had rallied around him in ways he never expected. The hashtag Justice for Jamal had become a rallying cry, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. Meanwhile, the fallout from Holloway's arrest was spreading like wildfire. The media had latched onto the story, and it was all anyone could talk about. Protests continued outside the police station, demanding accountability and reform. The chief of police, who had initially tried to downplay the situation, was now under intense scrutiny. He had no choice but to address the public. At a press conference held outside the station, the chief stood at the podium, his face grim. "The actions of Officer Brett Holloway do not represent the values of this department," he said, his voice strained. "We are committed to rooting out corruption and ensuring that justice is served. An internal investigation is underway, and we will take all necessary steps to restore the public's trust." The crowd wasn't satisfied. Shouts of "too little, too late," and "what about the others?" echoed through the air. The chief tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was out of his depth. This wasn't just about Holloway. It was about a system that had failed its people time and time again. Behind the scenes, Detective Elena Morales, Marcus Reed, and Officer Ryan Patel were working tirelessly to keep the momentum going. They knew that Holloway's arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. There were others in the department who had turned a blind eye to his actions, or worse, enabled them. "We need to go after the chief," Morales said during a meeting in Reed's office. He knew what Holloway was doing. He had to. Reed nodded, his expression serious. "Agreed. But we need more than just speculation. We need hard evidence." Patel, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. "What about the other officers? There's got to be someone who's willing to talk. Someone who's tired of covering for Holloway." Morales considered this. "It's risky. If we approach the wrong person, it could blow the whole investigation. It's a risk we have to take," Reed said. "We can't let this die down. Not now." While the adults strategized, Tasha was making moves of her own. She had become something of a local hero, her video sparking a movement that was gaining national attention. She was invited to speak at rallies and community meetings, and she didn't hold back. "This isn't just about my brother," she said at one such rally, her voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us, about every person who's ever been targeted, harassed, or abused by the people who are supposed to protect us. We can't let this go. We have to keep fighting." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy feeding off Tasha's passion. Jamal stood nearby, watching his sister with a mix of pride and awe. She had always been strong, but this was something else entirely. She was a force to be reckoned with. Back at the police station, tensions were running high. Holloway's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department, and officers were on edge. Some were angry, feeling betrayed by the department's leadership. Others were scared, worried that they might be next. And then there were those who were quietly relieved, hoping that this might finally be the push they needed to make real change. One of those officers was Maya Collins, a veteran cop who had been with the department for over a decade. Maya had always tried to do the right thing, but she had also seen the darker side of the job, the corruption, the cover-ups, the code of silence that kept bad cops in power. She had stayed quiet for years, telling herself that it wasn't her fight. But now she wasn't so sure. Maya approached Patel in the break room, her expression serious. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "Somewhere private?" Patel nodded, his heart racing. He followed Maya to an empty office, closing the door behind them. "What's going on?" he asked. Maya took a deep breath. "I know about the investigation, about Holloway, and I know there's more to this than just him." Patel hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "What do you mean?" "I mean the chief," Maya said, her voice low. "He's been covering for Holloway for years, and he's not the only one. There's a whole network of officers who've been protecting each other, no matter what." Patel's eyes widened. "Do you have proof?" Maya nodded. "I've been keeping records. Emails, reports, everything. I didn't know what to do with it. But now I think it's time." Patel felt a surge of hope. This was the break they had been waiting for. "We need to get this to Morales and Reed. They'll know what to do." As Patel and Maya worked to gather the evidence, Jamal and Tasha were preparing for their next move. They had decided to file a lawsuit against the department, not just for Jamal's wrongful arrest, but for the systemic racism and corruption that had allowed it to happen. It was a bold move, but they knew it was necessary. "This isn't just about me," Jamal said as they met with Marcus Reed to discuss the case. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Reed nodded, his expression determined. "We're going to hit them hard. They're not going to know what hit them." The stage was set for a showdown. The evidence was mounting, the public was watching, and the pressure was building. But as the pieces fell into place, one question remained. Would it be enough to bring down the system that had protected Holloway for so long? The evidence Officer Maya Collins provided was a game-changer. Emails, internal reports, and even recorded conversations between the chief of police and Holloway painted a damning picture of systemic corruption within the Cedarville Police Department. Detective Elena Morales, Marcus Reed, and Officer Ryan Patel worked late into the night, organizing the documents and preparing to take their findings public. "This is it," Morales said, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination. "This is what we've been waiting for. With this, we can take down not just Holloway, but the entire network that's been protecting him." Reed nodded, his eyes scanning the documents. "We'll need to move carefully. If we tip them off too soon, they'll destroy evidence and cover their tracks. We have to hit them hard and fast." Patel, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "What about the chief? He's not going to go down without a fight. And if he finds out we're onto him?" "He won't," Morales said firmly. "Not if we do this right. We'll need to coordinate with the district attorney's office. This is bigger than just us now." While the adults worked behind the scenes, Jamal and Tasha were preparing for their next move. The lawsuit against the police department was officially filed, and the media frenzy was reaching new heights. Reporters camped outside their apartment, eager for a statement, but Jamal and Tasha stayed focused. They knew this was about more than just headlines. It was about justice. At a community meeting held at a local church, Jamal stood before a packed room, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to me," he began. "I'm here to talk about what's happening to all of us. This isn't just about one bad cop or one wrongful arrest. This is about a system that's been broken for a long time, A system that's failed us over and over again. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Jamal. He took a deep breath and continued. But we have the power to change it. We have the power to demand better, to hold people accountable. And that's what we're going to do. The crowd erupted into applause, their energy feeding off Jamal's words. Tasha stood by his side, her expression one of quiet pride. She had always believed in her brother, but seeing him step into this role, this leader, this voice for change, filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Back at the police station, the tension was palpable. The chief of police, Robert Hayes, was growing increasingly paranoid. He had always been able to control the narrative, to keep the department's dirty laundry hidden from the public. But now, with Holloway in custody and the media breathing down his neck, he could feel the walls closing in. He called a meeting with his inner circle, officers he had trusted for years, those who had benefited from the system he had built. But even among them, there was a sense of unease. "We need to get ahead of this," Hayes said, his voice low and urgent. "If we don't, it's not just Holloway who's going down. It's all of us." One of the officers, Greg Simmons, spoke up. "What do you suggest we do? The media's already all over it. And with that lawsuit, we shut it down." Hayes said, his tone cold. "We discredit Carter. We make him look like a liar, a troublemaker. We remind people why they're supposed to trust us, not him." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. They had all been complicit in one way or another, and they knew what was at stake. Meanwhile, Morales, Reed, and Patel were finalizing their plan. They had scheduled a meeting with the district attorney, Karen Whitaker, to present their evidence. Whitaker had a reputation for being tough on crime, but she was also a political animal. They knew they would need to convince her that taking on the police department was worth the risk. The meeting took place in Whitaker's office, a sleek, modern space that reflected her no-nonsense personality. Morales laid out the evidence, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "This is about a culture of corruption that's been allowed to fester for years. If we don't act now, it's only going to get worse." Whitaker leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "This is a big ask," she said finally. "Taking on the police department, it's not going to be easy. There will be pushback. A lot of it. We know," Reed said. "But if we don't do something, nothing will change, and more people will get hurt." Whitaker was silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll take the case. But you need to be prepared for what's coming. This is going to get ugly." As the investigation into the police department gained momentum, Jamal and Tasha found themselves at the center of a growing movement. People from all walks of life were reaching out, offering their support, and sharing their own stories of injustice. It was overwhelming, but also empowering. For the first time, Jamal felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. But not everyone was on their side. Threats started coming in, anonymous calls, social media messages, even a brick thrown through their apartment window. Tasha wanted to call the police, but Jamal stopped her. "We can't trust them," he said, his voice firm. "Not yet. Not until we know who's on our side." Tasha nodded, though her hands were shaking. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Jamal pulled her into a hug, his heart aching for his sister. "We'll get through this," he said. Together. The pressure was building on all sides. The district attorney's office had launched a formal investigation into the police department, and the media was having a field day. Headlines like "Cedarville PD under fire" and "Systemic corruption exposed" dominated the news cycle. The chief of police was scrambling to contain the damage, but it was too late. The truth was coming out, and there was no stopping it. But as the investigation unfolded, a new threat emerged. Someone was leaking information to the press, details about the case that only someone on the inside would know. Morales, Reed, and Patel were furious. They had worked too hard to let it all fall apart now. "We need to find out who's behind this," Morales said, her voice tight with anger. "And we need to do it fast." The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle was far from over. But as the pieces of the puzzle came together, one thing was clear. The fight for justice was just beginning. The leak to the press sent shockwaves through the investigation. Sensational headlines like "Inside the Cedarville PD Scandal" and "Whistleblower Exposes Corruption" dominated the news, but the details being revealed were dangerously close to jeopardizing the case. Detective Elena Morales, Marcus Reed, and Officer Ryan Patel were furious. They had worked tirelessly to build a solid case, and now someone was undermining their efforts. "This is bad," Morales said, pacing the small conference room where they had been working. "If the chief and his cronies find out what we have, they'll destroy evidence before we can act." Reed leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "We need to find out who's leaking this information, and we need to do it fast." Patel, who had been quietly scrolling through his phone, looked up. "What if it's someone on our side? Someone trying to force our hand?" Morales stopped pacing and turned to him. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Patel said. "The leaks are putting pressure on the department, but they're also putting pressure on us. If we don't act soon, the public's going to start demanding answers. Maybe someone's trying to speed things up." Morales considered this. "It's possible, but it's still risky. If the wrong people find out what we have, this whole thing could blow up in our faces." Meanwhile, Jamal and Tasha were dealing with the fallout from the leaks. The media attention had intensified, and they were being hounded by reporters at every turn. But the worst part was the backlash. The threats had escalated, and they were starting to feel like prisoners in their own home. "I can't do this anymore," Tasha said one evening, her voice trembling. "I'm scared, Jamal. What if something happens to us?" Jamal pulled her into a hug, his heart breaking for his sister. "I know it's hard," he said, "but we can't give up now. We're so close. We just have to hold on a little longer." Tasha nodded, though her eyes were filled with tears. "I just wish it didn't have to be like this." Back at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Robert Hayes was growing increasingly desperate. The leaks had exposed more than he was comfortable with, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the investigation reached his doorstep. He called a meeting with his inner circle, his tone urgent. "We need to get ahead of this," he said, his voice low. "If we don't, we're all going down." One of the officers, Greg Simmons, spoke up. "What do you suggest we do? The media's already all over it, and with the DA involved, we discredit the investigation," Hayes said, his tone cold. "We make it look like a witch hunt. We remind people why they're supposed to trust us, not some kid with a grudge." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. They had all been complicit in one way or another, and they knew what was at stake. As the pressure mounted, Morales, Reed, and Patel were working around the clock to track down the source of the leaks. They had narrowed it down to a few possibilities, but they needed proof. That's when they got a break. Patel received an anonymous tip, a name and a location. It wasn't much, but it was enough to go on. He shared the information with Morales and Reed, and they decided to act on it. The location was a small diner on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, they found Officer Maya Collins sitting in a booth, her face pale but determined. "I figured you'd come," she said as they approached. Morales sat down across from her, her expression unreadable. "You're the one leaking information to the press." Maya nodded. "I had to. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing." "Not anymore." Reed leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've jeopardized the entire investigation." "I know," Maya said, her voice steady. "But I also know that if we don't act fast, the chief and his cronies are going to find a way to weasel out of this. They always do. I couldn't let that happen." Morales studied her for a moment, then sighed. "You took a big risk, but I get it. We're all tired of the same old story." With Maya's help, they were able to piece together a timeline of events and identify key players in the department's corruption. The evidence was overwhelming, and they knew it was time to act. They scheduled a meeting with District Attorney Karen Whitaker to present their findings. Whitaker listened intently as Morales laid out the case, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. "This is bigger than I thought," Whitaker said finally. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at a full-blown conspiracy." "It's true," Reed said, "and we have the evidence to prove it." Whitaker nodded, her jaw set. All right, let's take them down. The next morning, the Cedarville Police Department was rocked by a series of raids. Officers were arrested, files were seized, and the chief of police was taken into custody. The media went into a frenzy, and the public watched in shock as the scandal unfolded. Jamal and Tasha watched the news from their apartment, their emotions a mix of relief and disbelief. It was finally happening. The people who had wronged them, and so many others, were being held accountable. But as the dust began to settle, one question remained. What would happen next? The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. The arrest sent shockwaves through Cedarville. Chief Robert Hayes, along with several high-ranking officers, was led out of the police station in handcuffs, their faces a mix of defiance and disbelief. The media swarmed the scene, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. It was a moment of reckoning, one that no one in the town would soon forget. For Jamal and Tasha, watching the news felt surreal. The people who had caused them so much pain were finally facing consequences, but the victory was bittersweet. The scars of what they had been through, the fear, the humiliation, the sleepless nights, would take time to heal. Do you think this is really it? Tasha asked, her voice quiet as they sat together on the couch. Do you think things will actually change? Jamal sighed, running a hand over his face. I don't know, Tasha. I want to believe it will. But this is just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do. Tasha nodded, her expression thoughtful. At least people are paying attention now. That's something, right? Yeah, Jamal said, managing a small smile. It's something. Meanwhile, Detective Elena Morales, Marcus Reed, and Officer Ryan Patel were dealing with the fallout from the arrests. The department was in chaos, with officers scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Morales had been temporarily appointed as acting chief, a role she hadn't asked for but was determined to fulfill. We need to restore trust, she said during a meeting with the remaining officers. That starts with transparency. From now on, we do things by the book. No shortcuts, no cover-ups. If we mess up, we own it. Understood. The officers nodded, though some looked uneasy. Change wasn't going to be easy, but they knew it was necessary. As the investigation continued, more details came to light. The corruption within the department ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Officers had been involved in everything from evidence tampering to drug trafficking, all under the protection of Chief Hayes and his inner circle. It was a systemic issue, one that would take years to fully unravel. District Attorney Karen Whitaker held a press conference to address the public, her tone firm but measured. This is a dark chapter in Cedarville's history, she said, but it's also an opportunity for change. We will not rest until everyone involved is held accountable, and we will work tirelessly to ensure that something like this never happens again. The crowd erupted into applause, but Whitaker knew the road ahead would be difficult. The arrests were just the first step. The real challenge would be rebuilding trust and ensuring that the department was held to a higher standard. For Jamal and Tasha, the fight wasn't over either. They had filed a lawsuit against the department, and the case was gaining traction. But the legal battle was draining, both emotionally and financially. They had become symbols of the movement for justice, but the weight of that responsibility was heavy. I just want things to go back to normal, Tasha admitted one evening as they sat together on the porch. Is that too much to ask? Jamal put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I know, Tasha, but normal's not going to look the same anymore. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we can make it better. Tasha leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing. I hope so. As the weeks passed, the town began to heal. Community meetings were held to address concerns and discuss reforms. New policies were put in place to increase accountability within the police department, and efforts were made to rebuild trust with the community. But not everyone was ready to move on. For some, the scars ran too deep, and for others, the changes weren't happening fast enough. Protests continued, their voices a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. One evening, Jamal received a call from Marcus Reed. We need your help, Reed said, his tone serious. There's a town hall meeting tomorrow night. People are angry, and they need to hear from someone they trust, someone who understands what they're going through. Jamal hesitated. He had been trying to step back, to focus on healing and rebuilding his life. But he knew Reed was right. The community needed a voice, and he couldn't turn his back on them. "I'll be there," he said finally. The town hall meeting was packed, the air thick with tension. People from all walks of life had come to share their stories and demand change. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding. "I know how it feels to be let down by the people who are supposed to protect you," he began, his voice steady. "I know how it feels to be scared, to be angry, to feel like no one's listening. But I also know that we have the power to change things. We have the power to demand better. And we have the power to hold people accountable." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy feeding off Jamal's words. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what we've been through. And it's about building a future where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." As Jamal stepped away from the microphone, the crowd rose to their feet, their cheers echoing through the room. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the entire community. But even as the town began to heal, there were still challenges ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for Jamal, Tasha, and everyone who had been touched by the scandal, one thing was clear. They weren't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The town hall meeting marked a turning point for Cedarville. Jamal's speech had struck a chord, and the community's response was overwhelming. People who had once felt powerless were now finding their voices, and the momentum for change was building. But as the town moved forward, the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. For Jamal and Tasha, life was slowly returning to a new kind of normal. The lawsuit against the police department had been settled, and while no amount of money could undo the harm they had endured, it gave them a sense of closure. More importantly, it sent a message. The system could be held accountable. Jamal had decided to use part of the settlement to pursue his dream of opening a cafe. It wasn't just a business venture. It was a symbol of hope and resilience. He wanted to create a space where people could come together, share stories, and find comfort. Tasha, who had graduated high school with honors, was preparing to start college in the fall. She had decided to study criminal justice, inspired by the fight for accountability that had defined the past year. "I want to make sure no one else has to go through what we did," she told Jamal one evening as they sat in the empty space that would soon become his cafe. "I want to be part of the change." Jamal smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You already are, Tasha. You've always been." Meanwhile, Detective Elena Morales was settling into her new role as acting chief of police. It wasn't a position she had ever imagined herself in, but she was determined to make the most of it. Under her leadership, the department had begun implementing reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Body cameras were now mandatory for all officers, and a civilian review board had been established to oversee complaints and investigations. It wasn't easy. There were still officers resistant to change, and the department's reputation had taken a hit. But Morales was committed to rebuilding trust, one step at a time. Officer Ryan Patel had become one of her closest allies. His decision to come forward had cost him friendships within the department, but he had no regrets. He had joined the force to make a difference, and now he felt like he was finally living up to that promise. "We've got a long way to go," Patel said during a meeting with Morales. "But I think we're headed in the right direction." Morales nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We are. But we can't let our guard down. Change doesn't happen overnight." As the months passed, Cedarville began to heal. The protests had died down, but the sense of community that had emerged from the scandal remained strong. People were more engaged, more willing to speak out, and more determined to hold those in power accountable. Jamal's Cafe, which he named the Gathering Place, became a hub for the community. It was more than just a place to grab a cup of coffee. It was a space for connection and conversation. Local artists displayed their work on the walls, and community groups often held meetings there. For Jamal, it was a dream come true. One evening, as the cafe was closing, Jamal found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. It had been a year since his arrest, a year since his life had been turned upside down. So much had changed, but he felt stronger than ever. Tasha walked in, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Hey, big brother. You ready to head home?" Jamal smiled, wiping his hands on a towel. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked out into the cool evening air, Tasha linked her arm through his. "You know, I'm really proud of you," she said. "You've been through so much, but you never gave up. You're my hero, Jamal." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Tasha. That means a lot. But you're my hero, too. You've been so strong through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without you." Tasha grinned, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Well, you'll never have to find out. The fight for justice wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, still systems to be challenged, still wounds to heal. But for Jamal, Tasha, and the people of Cedarville, there was hope. They had proven that change was possible, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, they could come together and demand better. As they walked home, the streets quiet and the stars shining overhead, Jamal felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for it. He had his sister by his side, his community behind him, and a future full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like anything was possible. Thank you for following this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives. Let's keep the conversation going. Justice is a fight we all share.